Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast, Thursday, September 1st. It's a brand new month, and it's going to be a brand new hot air, but we'll have more on that later. Joining me, as always, on Thursdays, the Generalissimo, Duane Patterson of the Universe, Master of the Universe, HUGHNIVERSE.com, the troll-free web surfing experience for Hugh Hewitt fans and listeners. Duane, welcome back.
Always good to be back. How are you?
Well, I'm better because this is actually going to record properly. Because I sucked last week.
Well, it happens to the best of us.
I also had a recording with John Andrasik yesterday, and I screwed that one up too. John Andrasik, 5 for Fighting. He's going to be kind enough to redo it next week. So
okay, well,
sad.
Then you're right. You do suck.
I suck.
Okay,
absolutely. Now that we've established that, what's going on in the world today, Duane?
We always did this last night or the night before on the after show, which you were so kind to do every week. I always end by saying, so what are we going to talk about on the Ed Morrissey Show tomorrow? And, we have no idea, probably the same thing as last week, try to take over the world, right? But we actually had a pretty interesting show this morning. And one of the reasons we're a little late to the taping game to get ready for the podcast later today, which is now, if you're happening to listen to it, we had Dr. Oz on this morning. And it was the first time we had talked to Dr. Oz, and we had about a 13-minute interview live. We called in live, and it was a good interview. And as it turned out, we had Dr. Oz on the morning right after John Fetterman conducted his first TV interview. Did you know about that last night?
I did not know about that last night.
John Fetterman was across the street from a steel mill in Cat's Knuckles, Western Pennsylvania, somewhere. I don't know where he was.
Selena Zito's gonna come and get you for that one. You know that, right?
I know she is, and she would have good cause. But it looked like the basement of a bar somewhere, where it was basically two brick walls in a corner that he was in. He was doing it with his wife, who was there to basically help pick up the slack if he got stuck. I mean, it was very obvious it was a massaged interview. It was on MSNBC's 11th Hour, not with Brian Williams, but with Stephanie Ruhle, who has taken over that slot. And Stephanie Ruhle, who is a fine interview and knows how to conduct a tough interview if she deems she needs to. This was not one of those interviews. This was a live-to-tape interview. It was edited. It had all sorts of drop-ins over it and B-roll in case he kind of got stuck, so that they could micro cut the audio and make it sound and cleaned up a little bit. I have no idea how much editing was done, but it was not a live interview. It was definitely done pre-recorded live to tape. But it was the longest interview that he has done, the longest media appearance he has done since his return from the stroke and heart attack, back on, quote, the campaign trail, such that it is. He still won't agree to a debate. He still won't do anything that resembles what a normal candidate would do 2 months out in front of an election. But John Fetterman was there. Now, I want to play you one passage from this interview.
Okay.
It's about a minute and a half, both the question and then his answer, and then I want you and I to talk about it and what we think about it, because it was fascinating. It just was, on lots of levels. And now, going into it, let me start, and I know you join me in saying the same thing. We are not here to make fun of anybody that's had a stroke and a heart attack. That is not what this is about. We are not trying to be mean, nasty. We are not trying to poke fun at the infirm guy. What we are doing is we are trying to establish whether he actually has the physical and mental capabilities to actually discharge that job if he were to get enough votes, because the evidence is very much in question, because he keeps bobbing and weaving and ducking whether he does any media appearances, right?
Right.
Okay, so with that said, this is last night on the 11th Hour with Stephanie Ruhle. Here is John Fetterman right here.
There we go.
How do you serve all Pennsylvania voters? It's a very big state, right? Think about Western PA. In Pittsburgh, where the economy was thriving before COVID, filled with tech companies and universities. There's probably all sorts of people there thrilled about student debt forgiveness. But go 30 minutes outside to Beaver County, where there's likely voters who are saying, I just want a good kindergarten. I want a good 5th grade. How do you serve both voters? We've got a complicated economy. People want very different things.
Now, I'm going to stop it
Right,
there.
okay.
Question.
That's a good question, by the way. It's a pretty good question. It's a little, it's a little complex on policy, but not terribly so. I mean, this isn't terribly esoteric stuff, especially for a guy who's already lieutenant governor. If anything, in a normal situation, right, you have a lieutenant governor going up against an outsider, you'd almost say that that's too wonky for the outsider. But John Fetterman's an insider. He's lieutenant governor. He's been in Pennsylvania his whole life, I believe. So we should know this.
Okay, so Ed Morrissey, you're John Fetterman. you just heard the answer from Stephanie Ruhle.
Right.
What's the answer?
Well, honestly, I'm actually a little. I can tell you what my answer to this would be, which is that you've got to get government out of the way. You have to start incentivizing production again rather than incentivizing demand. I already know what my answers are.
But what I'm saying is, if you're John Fetterman, you already know what the answer is because she gave you the answer in the question.
It's a softball toss, is what you're saying. Absolutely. Well, it's MSNBC, and you expect a softball toss. It's still a good question.
It's a good question, but she did the leading part of the end of it, where she gave him where to go with it.
Yes,
she gave him the breadcrumbs to follow back to work his way through the answer. Right?
Okay, so what did he do?
Okay, here is the answer. Honest to God, if this was edited, this was the best they could do with the edit. Here's what he said. Let me go back and share. There.
I just think people need to understand and be able to recognize, what their lives are really like. And we believe and we know that we actually do that. Very important too. And, living in Western Pennsylvania, living across the street, actually where we're having this interview right now, right across from a steel mill. We have to understand that we all can't work at Google, or we can't all be working at a hospital. We have to make sure that we are making more stuff here in Pennsylvania and in America. And we also have to make sure that we address to an obscene minimum wage. And how can we now, running for the Senate, and you own 10 homes and you are not unwilling to raise a minimum wage above $7.25 an hour? We all know that Dr. Oz does live in New Jersey, but the simple is important too, to recognize how can you understand a life of a Pennsylvania resident if you have nothing to be able to serve one that has no clue on what life is like, living here in Pennsylvania.
What?
That was
what?
That was John Fetterman last night.
I guess the answer to every question that he's going to be asked, to the extent that he even holds himself open to reporters, is going to be, Mehmet Oz lives in New Jersey. That's the only answer that he actually got out of this. The only coherent answer you got out of that. Yes, we need to make more things in Pennsylvania. That actually is true. Why are we incentivizing demand rather than production?
Ed, that is a guy that can't collect his thoughts.
No. That's the reason why he's not going to debate either. And the campaign is admitting this. I think you and I did talk about this a little bit last night.
Yes.
Which is that Democrats really should have made a change in nominee when Fetterman had his stroke and wouldn't return to the campaign trail immediately. I think that they had, and I don't know what the law is in Pennsylvania. Maybe you guys discussed it today on the Hugh Hewitt show. But really, honestly,
no, we did. I went mining through that interview to find that one exchange. It hadn't been anywhere yet. It's MSNBC at 11 o'clock at night. Nobody's watching, right?
Oh, yeah.
Nobody's watching. So I happened to go through and mine it this morning, going through Brabian and work my way through it. And I got to that exchange and I went, oh my God, he really can't talk. He can't think. He can't do this yet. And again, I'm not trying to pick on the guy that's infirm. I'm really not. I wish he would go off somewhere and keep working on, speech therapy and trying to work his way back so that he's in fighting shape again. That said, he's not ready for this. Pennsylvania, if Pennsylvania truly understood that this is the guy that would be trying to represent them, they would be panic stricken because he can't do this. All he would be is just a token Chuck Schumer vote.
Right.
Chuck Schumer would. I mean, we use this rhetoric all the time about, oh, this person, this so-and-so, this Democrat is just going to be a puppet for Chuck Schumer. John Fetterman actually would be, because he can't do this on his own.
No. And it's clear, right? I mean, he can't even walk through an interview question by Stephanie Ruhle, let alone have a debate.
That
and
had the answer to the question in it.
Right.
And when he was finished, his wife jumped in to try to translate the gobbledygook he just uttered into something that was a coherent answer.
Yeah.
So his wife, who nobody knows, is jumping in. She's got no political experience, but she's trying to say, yeah, what he really meant to say was.
He is not up for this.
He's not up for this gig.
And honestly, I mean, just on a humanitarian level, a guy who's had that much of a profound effect from a stroke really should be focusing on his recovery, not on stressing himself out in a grueling Senate campaign and then going to Washington, D.C. and stressing himself out even further. I mean, I mean, the Democrats really need to do an intervention here. They need to push him off the ballot. And they need to put somebody else up. Put Connor Lamb up. I mean, honestly, they probably win anyway. They probably do better with Connor Lamb, frankly, than they do with John Fetterman. Certainly under these circumstances.
It may not be as close. It certainly wouldn't be as close as the race seems to be right now. Look, we conservatives, we pundits, we people on the right that have
a dog in the fight?
a platform in which to opine.
Yeah.
One of the things we kept hammering over and over again with Joe Biden coming down the home stretch was, look, he's just too darn old. It's not that we're picking on old people, but he just doesn't have the chops to be able to do this gig.
Right.
He's not up to this gig. Well, we're a year and a half into this, and Joe Biden is not up to this gig.
No, he's not. He's not up to this gig. But it's more profound, I think, with Fetterman. I mean,
I think it is too.
Because Biden can answer questions coherently in a press setting. We at least mostly coherently. This guy is really struggling, and I mean, I think that even MSNBC had to be looking at that and going,
Hugh, when he listened to that, he said, "Look, I know what happened here." He says, Stephanie and I have had kind of a falling out, but we were colleagues for a long time. When I was over on MSNBC, she used to be in my show all the time. There was some particular reasons why she doesn't do it anymore, and that's perfectly fine. But he says, I know what Stephanie Ruhle did as soon as that interview was over with.
Yeah.
She took her earpiece out, and she looked at her producers and she said, I did the best I could do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably right.
That's probably what she said.
All right, let's move on to another topic, because I think this one's an even bigger thing than Pennsylvania. Did you see the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times today about test scores for fourth graders cratering to their lowest level in 2 decades, but the worst drop in performance in decades?
Right. And didn't we hear the experts from the CDC? Didn't we hear Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins?
Yeah.
All the experts say, well, sure, there's an inconvenience factor there, but
kids are resilient. Kids are resilient.
Back. There's no evidence that there's any harm.
In-person education isn't necessary. Masking doesn't harm development. We heard all of this for the last 2 years, and now parents have been reporting anecdotally how far behind their kids were, and people were scolding those parents, calling them murderers for trying to force people back into classrooms where we already had science from June 2020 from the UK, which showed that schools were not community vectors for transmission,
Right.
vectors for community transmission is what I meant to say. And that children were not at risk unless they had multiple comorbidities. Children weren't at risk at all for acute COVID-19 infections. And yet we still kept the schools closed. And then when we brought them back, we kept them distanced and masked.
Philadelphia schools started their school year masking up for the first 10 days this year.
Yes.
It's criminal what we're doing to kids.
It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible what we're doing to kids. And now we have actual evidence of this. And you know who was hardest hit, Duane? And do you know why they were hardest hit? You can read the New York Times, got to go down a little bit in the New York Times to find this out. But you know who was hardest hit?
No.
Blacks and Hispanics. Blacks and Hispanics were hardest hit. And do you know why?
No.
Their schools remained closed longer than white schools did.
Did they now?
Did they? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that an interesting development? So they are actually now farther behind, thanks to teachers' unions that kept these places locked up tight, and the CDC's obeisance to those teachers' unions in issuing guidelines that state and local officials took as gospel. Which was that, well, you know, it's better to be safe than sorry. Let's keep them closed. Let's keep people distanced. Let's slap masks on everybody, even though the masks don't work and kids aren't at risk. And the teachers, if they've got vaccinated first, aren't at risk.
What do you want to bet? What do you want to bet that in a couple of years, when we start seeing some of the state testing that comes out from individual states, and they start ranking student performance in math and English and all, the STEM courses,
Yep.
all the ones that matter. When we start ranking the states by which kids are performing the most, what do you want to bet?
And the least.
What do you want to bet that when we start getting data for the next couple of years, that when these kids start getting into high school, the ones that perform the best are Florida, Georgia, Texas, some of the southern states that reopened schools and went back to in-person learning sooner.
It's interesting.
What do you want to bet that that's what the data turns out to be?
Well, the data in this turns out to be that the West actually did better than the worst was the Midwest and the Northeast. And you can figure out why, but the South didn't do very good either. The West actually did better than everybody else did. But again, this is one data set. My guess is that you're right. I think that the states that when you start seeing state by state data over the next several years, you're going to see that kids in places like Florida and Texas.
I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
That everybody reacted to the actual lockdown one way. I guess my thesis or my proposition is the southern states that opened up sooner may have limited the damage over time and started to correct the damage by getting actual in-person instruction sooner, rather than places like in the Northeast or in LA Unified or all these other whacked out Oregon or Washington that wouldn't reopen schools.
Right. And this is the failure of technocratic rule, right? This is the rule by experts is a failure because the experts aren't God. They get things wrong, and they got things massively wrong multiple times in this pandemic. And to be fair, it was a fairly novel event. I mean, nobody expected people to be on top of every single detail on something that they'd never seen before. But that type of humility never entered into policy making. These guys were treated as though they were the oracles on high, and this is what you get from that.
And not just were treated like oracles on high, but demanded to be treated. In Anthony Fauci's case,
I am science. If you're against me, you're against science.
Demanded to be treated as the oracle on high.
Yeah, because they're science, man. You don't mess with science.
Yes.
Yeah. He is the science. The science. Yeah, I mean this. Well, this is exactly what we've been talking about for the last 2 years, which is that people were the experts were so focused on one particular range of risk that they never considered the other risks involved. And that's the reason why you don't put experts in charge. You put elected officials in charge. Because elected officials, because of their accountability to the voters, have to consider the wide range of risks.
They hear from those people. They hear from parents who are saying, do you understand what you people are doing to my kid?
Yes. Yes.
Whereas Anthony Fauci doesn't give a rip.
No, because he's going off the basis of his view of the science on one narrow aspect of this. They don't even consider the other risks, the risks to child development, the risks to the economy. They didn't consider those risks either.
Right. All he did was assume. Based off my scientific expertise, my assumption is, kids will recover. They're just kids. Who cares about them? The economy.
They don't vote.
Yeah, they don't vote. The economy, we'll just print more money. It's not the end of the world. Everybody will make do.
Right. And now we're dealing with the fallout of all of these decisions.
10% inflation in kids that are 3 years behind in school.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with dealing with the inflation. The inflation is a short-term issue. If we pull our heads out of our collective economic butts and actually apply supply-side economics to that issue.
But we destroyed the education of a generation of kids.
These kids, I mean, the Wall Street Journal puts it this way: these kids may never recover. They may be so far behind now that they never actually recover. We may have a generation of kids who just simply can't catch up by the time they finish high school. They're too far behind. 2 years being left out, and they're too far behind. Now, that's not true of every single child that's in that cohort. Some of those kids transferred to, homeschooling, and those kids probably are going to do better than the other kids. But if you're talking about stratification, and if you're concerned about stratification between the haves and have-nots, this is an absolute catastrophe, because the haves are going to have been able to take care of their children and get them educated, while the have-nots had no resources without the public schools to do that.
So in 15, 20 years, you're going to be dealing with the impacts of the moron blip.
Yes. Yes. The moron blip. I don't want to say moron blip. It's not the kids' fault. No, it's not their fault.
It's not the kids' fault. But I'm saying, we are going, as a society, we are going to pay for that. You're going to pay for it in higher crime. You're going to pay for it in more poverty. You're going to pay for it in homelessness. You're going to pay for it in drug abuse. You're going to pay for it in a spike through that thing, because you've got kids that didn't get educated to the point where they can compete in a free society amongst, or in a world economy. They're not going to be able to compete because they don't have the skill set.
Exactly. Duane, we're going to have to wrap things up here pretty quick, but I do want to get to what's coming up on tomorrow's Hugh Hewitt Show. I'm sorry, you've already done today's Hugh Hewitt Show. What's coming up on tomorrow's Hugh Hewitt Show?
Tomorrow's Hugh Hewitt Show is going to be kind of interesting. We are going to do an interview with Blake Masters, who is tightening up the race in Arizona. That is going to be of interest. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin will be joining us. Always nice to have somebody from Wisconsin come on the show. So we'll do that. We'll bring movies back with Sonny Bunch, and of course, an interview with Larry Arnn. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start talking about that whole 2-year gap and what it did to kids with one of the nation's preeminent educators, Dr. Larry Arnn.
Well, as always on Fridays, and that's always a great segment on the Hugh Hewitt Show, and that can be heard at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 a.m. in God's time zone, 3 a.m. on the left coast. And if you're a member of the Universe, you not only get to watch the show unfold before your very eyes, also if you're on Salem Now or Salem News Channel.
Salem News Channel.
Salem News Channel. Salem Now is a separate thing. Should belong to both, by the way. Subscribe to both. But if you're on Salem News Channel, you can also watch it live there. But on the Universe, you can watch it live. And you can also get Duane's fabulous after shows in the evening, plus lots more content. But if you're not a member, you're going to have to tune in to the AM radio dial. And Duane, what should people do if they can't find it on the AM radio dial?
You bring John Fetterman with you, and you have him sit down in front of a GM that should have us on the air, and you let John Fetterman speak to him until he finally relents and lets us on.
Well, that's one way to do it. I would argue that you just you bring Anthony Fauci on to explain to the AM radio dial managers that the AM radio dial doesn't actually exist.
That's one way to do it.
That's one way to do it, right? I mean, that would work. All right. Well, until then, Duane Generalissimo Patterson, happy Labor Day, by the way. And we got lots to talk about the next time you're on here. So we'll leave that as a teaser.
Yes, I'm thinking Labor Day is a precursor of things to come.
Things to come, indeed. Duane Generalissimo Patterson at Radio Blogger on the Twitters is. Thanks for being with us. We'll talk to you then.
See you guys.
Stay tuned for just a little bit more from the Ed Morrissey Show coming up right now. Thank you for watching and listening to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Be sure to subscribe at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube to get alerted as soon as new episodes get published. You can support the Ed Morrissey Show and Hot Air's VIP reporting by becoming a VIP member, too. Visit hotairvip.com and use the promo code SAVEAMERICA, all one word, for 40% off your membership. Choose VIP Gold and gain membership to access to all of the Town Hall sites. Thanks again for watching and listening.